Before we unravel this haunting mystery, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a case that demands to be told. 68 years ago, in the quiet hills of Mill Creek, Pennsylvania, a 5-year-old girl disappeared without a trace on what should have been an ordinary Tuesday morning. Her name was Mia Thompson. Gray eyes, blonde hair, always adorned with a pink ribbon. She vanished somewhere between her white-painted house and the schoolhouse just over a mile away, leaving behind nothing but that ribbon beneath an oak tree, and a family forever broken by unanswered questions. The investigation pointed to a neighbor, a mechanic who kept to himself, a man who fled town within days of Mia's disappearance. But without a body, without witnesses, without concrete evidence, the case went cold. The file gathered dust. The town moved on. Everyone moved on. Everyone except Margaret Thompson, Mia's mother, who refused to believe her daughter was gone forever. For decades, Margaret clung to a mother's desperate hope, insisting that somewhere, somehow, Mia was still alive. Then, years later, an investigative journalist cracked open that forgotten file and discovered something. One overlooked detail buried in the original reports. A detail so critical, so explosive, it would shatter everything investigators thought they knew about the case. In 1957, Mill Creek was the kind of place where time seemed to move slower than the rest of America. Nestled among rolling Pennsylvania hills, it was a small town built on familiarity and routine. Wooden houses with creaking porches lined the dusty main road. Neighbors greeted each other by name every single morning. Kids rode their bikes past the old post office, their laughter echoing through streets that rarely saw trouble. This was post-war America, a place where people still trusted their neighbors, where front doors were left unlocked, and where a child could ride a bicycle to school without anyone thinking twice about it. On the eastern edge of town stood the Thompson residence, a white-painted house with a weathered tin roof that had seen better days. It wasn't fancy, but it was home. Thomas Thompson, the father, was a man shaped by war and hard labor. He had served his country, come back with scars nobody could see, and found work at the steel mill in Altoona. Every morning before dawn, he would rise from bed, brew a pot of strong black coffee so thick you could almost stand a spoon in it, and quietly prepare himself for another grueling shift. He was a man of few words, the kind who showed love through provision rather than affection. His wife, Margaret, was his opposite in many ways. Where Thomas was silent and stoic, Margaret was warm and expressive. She gave piano lessons from their living room, teaching the neighborhood children how to read music and find melodies within the ivory keys. The sound of scales and simple songs drifted through the open windows most afternoons, becoming part of the town's soundtrack. Margaret was meticulous, the kind of woman who kept everything organized, who wrote lists in a small leather notebook she carried everywhere, who believed that order and routine could keep chaos at bay. Between them was their daughter, their only child, 5-year-old Mia Thompson. She had inherited her mother's blonde hair and her father's gray eyes, a striking combination that made her stand out even in a crowd. Mia was the kind of child who saw wonder in everything. She loved to draw, carrying a small sketchbook wherever she went, capturing birds on fence posts, flowers in the neighbor's garden, the way sunlight fell through tree branches. That pink ribbon in her hair had become her signature, the thing everyone remembered about her. That morning started like any other. The sky stretched clear and blue above Mill Creek, though a light mist still clung to the grass, refusing to burn off despite the climbing sun. Inside the Thompson kitchen, the radio played a cheerful children's program, the announcer's voice crackling slightly through the speaker. The smell of fresh coffee mingled with the scent of toast and eggs. Margaret stood at the stove, preparing breakfast with practiced efficiency. Thomas sat at the small wooden table, reading the Huntingdon Daily News, his rough hands turning the pages carefully. Mia sat across from him, eating her scrambled eggs, and asking, in that innocent, curious way children do, whether her father had the night shift that day. After the meal, Thomas folded his newspaper, stood, and kissed his daughter on the forehead, a rare display of tenderness that he reserved for these quiet moments. Then he grabbed his lunch pail, and headed out the door toward another day at the mill. Margaret cleared the dishes, then turned her attention to Mia, retying the pink bow in her daughter's hair, making sure it was secure and pretty. She helped Mia into her small backpack, checked that she had everything she needed for school, then walked her outside to where the little red bicycle waited. It had been a birthday gift just weeks earlier, and Mia treasured it like nothing else. The dirt road that led to school was just over a mile long, cutting through a corridor of maple trees that formed a natural canopy overhead. It was a route Mia had traveled dozens of times, always alone, always safe. She would pedal slowly, stopping occasionally to pick wildflowers growing along the roadside, or to wave at familiar faces she passed along the way. It was a simple journey, one that seemed to carry no danger in a town where everyone knew everyone, where nothing bad ever happened. Mrs. Emma Fielding, a neighbor who lived 2 houses down from the Thompsons, was watering her plants on her front porch that morning when she saw Mia ride past. She waved, and Mia waved back, that pink ribbon bobbing as she pedaled. Emma noticed something else too, an old green pickup truck that had been crawling along the road behind the girl. It slowed down near where Mia was riding, then turned onto a parallel side road and disappeared from view. Emma thought nothing of it at the time. She assumed it was a delivery truck, maybe someone making a drop-off at one of the farms. She went back to her watering, the moment already fading from her mind. The rest of the morning unfolded with its usual rhythm. Margaret returned inside and gave her first piano lesson of the day, guiding a young student through a simple piece while the notes drifted out through the open windows and into the autumn air. When noon approached, she wrapped up the lesson, saw the child out, then went to the kitchen to prepare lunch. That's when she noticed it, the unusual quiet that had settled over the house. Something felt wrong, though she couldn't quite name what it was. Habit made her glance at the wall clock. Too much time had passed. Mia should have been home by now. If you're finding this case as disturbing as we are, do us a favor. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from, and don't forget to hit that like button. Your support helps us continue bringing these untold stories to light. Margaret felt the first flutter of concern in her chest. She threw on her coat and stepped outside, walking briskly toward the road Mia would have taken. The sun slanted through the trees at a sharp angle now, casting long shadows across the ground. Dry leaves crunched under Margaret's feet as she walked, calling her daughter's name. At first, her voice was calm, measured, the tone of a mother who expects an answer any second. But with each step that brought no response, her calls grew more urgent, more desperate. The wind seemed to swallow her voice, carrying it away into the empty air where it dissolved without echo. She passed the small wooden bridge that crossed over the creek, reached the turn where the dirt road curved slightly, and entered a thicker patch of woods. And there, beneath the sprawling branches of an old oak tree, something caught her eye, something pink against the brown earth. Margaret's heart stopped. She knew what it was before she even reached it. The ribbon. The same pink ribbon she had tied in Mia's hair that very morning. It lay there in the dirt, detached, abandoned, silent testimony to something terrible. Margaret picked it up with trembling hands, her mind racing through possibilities, each one worse than the last. She screamed Mia's name into the woods, her voice cracking with terror. She searched the surrounding area frantically, looking behind trees, checking the ditches, calling until her throat was raw. But there was nothing. No bicycle, no backpack, no sign of her daughter, just that ribbon, and the deafening silence of the forest. Within an hour, the entire town knew. News traveled fast in a place like Mill Creek. Thomas was pulled from his shift at the mill and came racing home. Neighbors formed search parties and combed through the woods, calling Mia's name until darkness fell. The local sheriff, a man named Robert Dalton, organized a more systematic search the following morning, bringing in volunteers from neighboring towns. They searched for 3 days straight, covering every inch of forest, every abandoned barn, every potential hiding place within a 10-mile radius. They dragged the creek. They checked wells. They looked everywhere a small child could possibly be. But Mia Thompson had vanished as completely as if the earth itself had opened up and swallowed her whole. Sheriff Dalton quickly turned his attention to potential suspects. In a town this small, strangers stood out, and there hadn't been any strangers around that morning. That meant whoever took Mia, if someone had taken her, was likely someone local, someone the family knew, someone the town trusted. The investigation focused on a man named Vernon Holt, a mechanic who lived just 3 houses down from the Thompsons. Vernon was in his mid-30s, a quiet man who kept mostly to himself. He ran a small auto repair shop out of his garage and was known for being good with engines but awkward with people. He had no wife, no children, and few friends. In a town built on social connection, his isolation made him stand out. What made Vernon a suspect wasn't just his proximity to the Thompson home. It was his behavior in the days following Mia's disappearance. While the rest of the town rallied together, organizing searches and offering support to the devastated family, Vernon remained distant. He didn't join the search parties. He didn't offer condolences. And then, just 4 days after Mia vanished, Vernon Holt packed up his belongings, closed his shop, and left Mill Creek without a word to anyone. He didn't tell neighbors where he was going. He didn't settle his accounts at the local stores. He just disappeared. And that sudden departure screamed guilt to everyone who heard about it. Sheriff Dalton tried to track Vernon down, but the trail went cold almost immediately. Vernon had no known relatives, no forwarding address, no clear destination. It was as if he had deliberately erased himself. The sheriff filed reports with surrounding counties, circulated Vernon's description. But in 1957, without the technology and databases that would come later, finding someone who didn't want to be found was nearly impossible. The investigation stalled. Without a body, without physical evidence, without witnesses who saw anything concrete, there was simply nowhere else to go. The case remained open, but active investigation stopped. The file was placed in a cabinet, and slowly, painfully, Mill Creek tried to move forward. But Margaret Thompson couldn't move forward. While her husband Thomas retreated into silence and long hours at the mill, burying his grief in work, Margaret refused to accept that her daughter was gone. She kept Mia's room exactly as it had been. The bed made, the toys arranged on the shelf, the drawings pinned to the wall. She continued to set a place for Mia at the dinner table. She wrote letters to police departments, to newspapers, to anyone who might listen, begging them to keep looking. Other mothers in her position might have held funerals, might have sought closure, but Margaret insisted that Mia was alive somewhere. She could feel it, she said, the way only a mother could. That connection had not been severed. Her daughter was out there, waiting to be found. Years turned into decades. The 1,960 seconds came and went. The 1,970 seconds brought new troubles to America, and the small tragedy of one missing girl in Pennsylvania faded from public consciousness. Thomas Thompson died in 1981, his heart finally giving out after years of silent suffering. Margaret lived on alone in that white house with the tin roof, growing old with her grief, never abandoning her belief that Mia would come home. The town remembered, of course. How could they forget? But the sharp pain of the tragedy dulled into a sad historical fact, the kind of story old-timers would mention when talking about how things used to be different, how the world used to be safer. Then, in 2019, something happened that would change everything. A journalist named Sarah Chen, who specialized in cold cases for a true crime podcast, came across a reference to Mia Thompson's disappearance while researching missing children cases from the 1,950 seconds. Something about the case caught her attention, the way it had been abandoned so quickly, the lack of thorough investigation by modern standards, the fact that Vernon Holt had never actually been found or questioned. Sarah decided to dig deeper. She traveled to Mill Creek, which by then had grown somewhat, but still retained its small-town character. She visited the library, pored over old newspaper archives, and requested the original police file from the county records office. What Sarah found in that file was shocking, not because of what was there, but because of what wasn't. The investigation had been cursory at best. There were no detailed witness statements, No forensic analysis of the ribbon, which had been returned to the family rather than preserved as evidence. No systematic canvassing of everyone who lived along Mia's route to school. The entire investigation seemed to hinge on Vernon Holt's suspicious departure, with little effort made to explore other possibilities. But it was one small detail, buried in a brief witness statement, that made Sarah's pulse quicken. Mrs. Emma Fielding, the neighbor who had seen Mia ride past that morning, had mentioned the green pickup truck in her statement to police. But the detail had been dismissed almost immediately. Why? Because Vernon Holt didn't own a green pickup truck. He drove a black sedan. The investigators had been so focused on Vernon as the prime suspect that they had ignored evidence that didn't fit their theory. No one had ever tried to identify who owned that green truck, or where it had gone, or why it had been following a 5-year-old girl on her way to school. Sarah began investigating the green truck angle with the tools and resources that hadn't existed in 1957. She cross-referenced vehicle registration records from that period, interviewed descendants of people who had lived in Mill Creek back then, and slowly pieced together a list of people who had owned green trucks in the area. One name stood out. A man named Dale Pritchard, who had worked as a delivery driver for a regional supply company. Dale's route had taken him through Mill Creek several times a week. He owned a green Chevrolet pickup, the exact model Emma Fielding had described. And there was something else. In 1959, just 2 years after Mia disappeared, Dale Pritchard had been arrested in Ohio for the attempted abduction of a 7-year-old girl. He served 5 years in prison, was released, and died in 1987. Sarah's discovery sent shockwaves through what remained of Mill Creek's collective memory. The wrong man had been suspected all along. Vernon Holt, who had left town not out of guilt, but possibly out of fear of being falsely accused, had been innocent. The real predator had been someone who passed through regularly, someone whose presence wouldn't have seemed unusual, someone who had a documented history of targeting children. But by the time this came to light, everyone directly involved was dead. Vernon Holt was never found and was presumed deceased. Dale Pritchard was long buried, and Margaret Thompson, who had died in 2003 at the age of 89, never knowing what had really happened to her daughter, never getting the answers she had spent her entire life seeking. The revelation devastated the community in a new way. The guilt of having suspected the wrong man, of having let the real perpetrator slip away, of having failed Mia so completely, it all came rushing back as if the crime had happened yesterday. But there was still one question that haunted everyone who learned about the case. What had happened to Mia Thompson? Without remains, without confession, without any physical evidence of her fate, that question seemed destined to remain unanswered forever. Then Sarah found something else. While researching Dale Pritchard's background, she discovered that in 1958, a year after Mia's disappearance, a family named the Prestons, who lived in a rural area outside of Columbus, Ohio, had adopted a young girl they claimed to have found abandoned at a rest stop. The girl appeared to be around 6 years old, had blonde hair and gray eyes, and could not or would not tell them her name. The Prestons, who had been trying to have children for years without success, saw it as a blessing. They named her Jane, never officially reported finding her to authorities, and raised her as their own in relative isolation on their farm. Sarah tracked down Jane Preston, who was now in her late 60s and living in Florida. When Sarah approached her with old photographs of Mia Thompson and details about the case, Jane's reaction was immediate and visceral. She didn't remember much from her early childhood, only fragments. A White House, a woman's voice singing, the feeling of riding a bicycle. The Prestons had told her she had been abandoned, that they had saved her. But she had always felt like something was missing, like there was a part of her life that existed in shadow. DNA testing confirmed what Sarah and Jane both suspected. Jane Preston was Mia Thompson. She had been alive all along, just as Margaret had always believed. She had been taken by Dale Pritchard, held somewhere for days or weeks, then apparently abandoned when he realized the heat of the investigation was too intense. The Prestons had found her, made the selfish decision to keep her rather than report her, and raised her in ignorance of her true identity. Mia had lived her entire life, not knowing who she really was, not knowing that a mother had died, still hoping for her return, not knowing that an entire town had mourned her loss. If this story has moved you, we need your help to keep bringing these cases to light. Please hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe to Untold Case Desk so we can continue giving voice to the stories that deserve to be heard. The discovery made international news. The case that had been cold for 62 years was finally, impossibly, solved. But the resolution brought no joy, only a profound sadness for all the lost years. For Margaret, who never knew. For Thomas, who died in anguish. For Vernon Holt, who lived under a cloud of suspicion he didn't deserve. And for Mia herself, who had to grapple with the reality that her entire identity had been built on a lie. She had lived a full life as Jane Preston, had married, had children and grandchildren, but she had been stolen from another life entirely, stolen from parents who loved her, from a town that never forgot her. Today, the White House in Mill Creek still stands, though it has changed hands many times. A small memorial plaque was placed near the oak tree where the pink ribbon was found, honoring the little girl who vanished and the mother who never stopped believing. Mia, now living as Jane Preston with full knowledge of her past, has visited Mill Creek several times, walking the road she rode that morning, standing in the home she barely remembers, trying to connect with a life that was taken from her before she was old enough to hold on to it. She has said in interviews that she doesn't blame the Prestons, who she believes genuinely thought they were helping an abandoned child, but she grieves for what was stolen, not just from her, but from Margaret and Thomas, who deserve to know that their daughter survived. The case of Mia Thompson stands as a haunting reminder of how justice can fail, how assumptions can blind investigators, how one overlooked detail can mean the difference between resolution and eternal mystery. It shows us that the truth, no matter how long buried, has a way of surfacing, and it reminds us that sometimes the impossible is true, that sometimes hope is not delusion, that sometimes a mother's instinct is the most reliable evidence of all. Before you go, we want to hear from you. What do you think about this case? How do you think the investigation should have been handled? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to Untold Case Desk and hit that notification bell so you never miss another case that needs to be told. These stories matter. These lives matter. And, together, we make sure they're never forgotten. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next case.